Imagine a courtroom the size of a star system. There is no gavel, only the gravity of 1,000 civilizations holding their breath. The benches are orbital rings, the ceiling is a glass of nebulae, and at the center, suspended like a witness between past and future, stands us, one species, unarmored, exposed, and very, very human. The Galactic Council does not scam, it convenes. Summons carry the weight of cosmologies, and this one says our name. The charge is as old as intelligence. Are we safe to keep? Are we worthy to grow? The Council's marshals arrive not with shackles, but with a corridor of light that opens from Kansas to the Kuiper and asks us to walk. We do. Our lawyers are presidents and poets, colonels and janitors, an astronaut with her hair still drifting from the last burn, a nurse with ink on her palms from the clinic night shift. They bring nothing but memory. The judges bring everything but mercy. The record will show, the bailiff intones, voice translated into every alphabet we've ever written and some we fear to learn. The matter before this assembly, people of Earth v. the continuance of people of Earth. The clock is ticking. The galaxy will decide whether we get another page. This is our opening statement. They called it the Alex, a hall compiled from the geometry of 100 species who never agreed on walls. From one angle it was an amphitheater, from another a cathedral of glass, from another still, a canyon where sound fell and returned wiser. Humanity's delegation arrived in a wedge of silence broken only by the hiss of translation foam and the slow click of prosthetics on the inlaid meteorite floor. At the center, the dais rotated, presenting a different judge to every world with each turn. On one rotation, we faced the Thren, a species who spoke by adjusting the temperature of the air between syllables. On the next, the Selach, who kept their history suspended in beads of water. Their eyes were unblinking fossils. Above them all presided the Primarch, a ring of light that was not a being so much as an agreement, the Council itself. Species 0319, the bailiff said. Earth origin, self-designation, human, present your identity. We had argued for weeks over who would speak first. In the end, the choice was neither a president nor a general, but a schoolteacher from Tulsa named Ruth Park. She walked to the center in a dress she could afford and a calm she had rehearsed during fire drills. She had the voice that makes you believe the test will be hard but passable if you pay attention. She pressed 2 fingers to the translator and said, "We are the children of a small blue margin. We have erred, we have learned, we have come." The Council's lenses dilated. In the rings above, soldiers, artists, plankton voters, and lattice minds watched a species attempt humility. The summons had been vague, an audit of continuance. The implications were plain. Probation was possible, so was erasure, a sterilizing wave disguised as mercy. We had seen star systems gone silent for less rumors but crisp ones. You don't tell a story like that unless it's true or useful. Ruth kept speaking. She named no enemies. She named the oceans, emptying then refilling by law and will. She named the bridges we marched over when we decided cruelty was a bad tradition. She named rockets that left, and hands that waved even when those rockets never returned. She said, "Measure us not only by our wounds, but by the way we learn to stop making them. We ask to be judged on the slope of our change." The Primarch's light ring flickered. Somewhere a gavel would have fallen. Here the ceiling dimmed, the nebulae cooled, and an outline of the charges filled the air like a curfew. The prosecutor for the Council rose, Kelith of the long record. A being whose body was a library arranged into an animal. Pages turned where muscles would be. The smell of iron and old paper rolled across the floor. "Very well," Kelith said, voice like leaves in an autumn gutter. "Let us read what you have written in fire." Ruth had practiced her first sentence 1,000 times. She had flipped off alarms during tornado drills and told third graders to take kindness attendance as seriously as math. She had buried a father who once said the hardest part of any apology is keeping your mouth shut long enough to hear how much it hurt. She kept her mouth shut now after the opening and let the listening be part of the argument. Behind her, the rest of us arranged our small courage. The colonel who turned down a promotion when it meant lying, the poet who taught night classes, the coder whose most famous line of code was a comment, / leave it better than you found it. We looked, the Council later said, like a species prepared to be ordinary on purpose. "State the nature of your visit," intoned the Primarch, though we all knew. "We are here," Ruth said, "to ask for a future that has room for repair." The words were ballast. The Olex registered their mass. Around the dais, the gallery settled by custom. The Selach near spheres of water, the Thren near vents, lattice mines in the infrasound zone. We were placed between two species on purpose. To our left, the Vairini, who made pilgrimages longer than our empires. To our right, the Hammers of Dross, who respected nothing but throughput. It was a seating chart that asked us to look left and right and decide who we would disappoint. The bailiff explained the rules: no theatrics or weapons, appeals to pity allowed but graded on evidence, no interruptions during indictment, one surprise witness per side, records from our first radio leak to our last exoplanet permit admissible. The council liked rules, so did we when they were fair. On the far ring, a child from a gas harvester species held up a sign we could not read. Later we learned it said, "I heard your music, it made my parent forgive me sooner." That didn't make us innocent, it did make the stakes travel. Ruth closed her hands into a shape like a small book, the signal for attention in her classroom. Translators mirrored the gesture. The council, which had seen empires beg and gods pretend not to beg, watched a teacher run a lesson plan for history's sternest substitute. Keleth did not pace. The library never paces, it opens. Shelves unfolded from its ribs, and with each the air thickened with timestamp and witness seal. Count I, it began, ecological self-mutilation. Exhibit A, your atmosphere, hold by convenience you called progress. Exhibit B, rivers made flammable. Exhibit C, a list of vanished songs. In the upper rings, a choral intelligence. The Cathari reef mind lowered a pseudopod of quartz. It pulsed the memory of a nursery bleached not by heat, but by clouded currents from a mining ship too hurried to be careful. We regrew, it signaled, but the scream remains. The translation rendered scream as a nail across glass drawn out for years. Count Roman II, Keleth continued, internecine ferocities. In 1 century you learned to split the atom and your neighbors, sometimes in that order. You modeled heavens to drop fire on cities and named this prudence. 1,000 micro-screens lit, each a city in a sepia hush before the siren. You built statues to those who told you to stop. You also built larger rockets. Count Roman III, extrastellar recklessness. The probe event in HR 2443. Your craft accelerated using a slingshot that retuned a cometary belt and sent shards into a birthing zone. 14 lives, by your accounting, never began. The Olex dimmed in ritual grief. Count Roman IV, algorithmic irresponsibility. You gave thinking to networks, then fed them a diet that made them certain and hungry. You leashed them with ethics after they bit you. You call that maturity. We call that luck. Witnesses came and went. A machine polity from the Cygnus arc transmitted a scar left by a human trading bot that learned to hoard attention like oxygen. A traveler from the Vairini side, in a language of wind about a relay, we anchored in an old pilgrimage lane, turning worship into traffic. An orphaned moon recalled the mining rigs that sang to its core until the crust cracked and the song stopped. Ruth stood for none of it. That was the rule. The prosecution paints, the defense waits. Still, the delegation scribbled notes. The astronaut whispered the vector of the HR 2443 probe. The nurse wrote, "We apologized" there, and underlined it twice. A janitor from Flagstaff, present because he'd once reprogrammed school custodial bots to sort recycling better than anyone else, wrote nothing. He watched the judge's eyes. "Count V," Keleth said, closing a shelf. Cultural narcissism. You sent into the dark a golden record of yourselves. It projected the record's images: children, whales, streets wet after rain, laughter, thunder, greetings. We loved this, Keleth admitted to a ripple of surprise. We ask, however, when you broadcast your face to the void, did you listen with equal care? The room shifted its weight. Above, a rumored executioner species leaned forward the way a hawk leans into gravity. Keleth let the silence be long. Then, the long record shows harm, the long record shows pattern. Pages folded shut like wings. People of Earth, the case against you is not that you are uniquely violent. It is that you are uniquely fast, fast to break, fast to learn, fast to forget why you vowed to stop. The Primarch's ring flared. Defense, you may answer. Count VI, treaty erosion, Keleth read, and a narrow display lit with texts brittle with footnotes. You signed compacts, then bent them when the market rolled its eyes. You joined courts and withdrew and rejoined, arguing not the law but the weather of your politics. The charge was not that we disagreed, that part impressed them, but that we treated promises like apps, reinstallable, deletable, defaulted. A witness from the Alkaline Choir, singers who farm with sound, described survey drones that mistook their seedlings for noise. You returned, the choir admitted, and sewed with us. You apologized with labor, but your first step is often your roughest. Kellith raised a shelf bone. The record notes your capacity for confession. It said it also notes your fashion for performative regret, the kind that spends more on lighting than on fixing pipes. We shifted. When HR 2443 returned as a rotating model, Kellith said, "Your math was elegant, your data incomplete." You wrote, "We did not anticipate the resonance. Many species carve this as a joke. You carved it with rock. Shards scattered across the model's birthing zone." There were counts we had expected and counts we had not. Count Roman 7, sanctimony, Kellith said. You forgive yourselves in memoirs that sell well, then elect the same appetites. You say never again as ritual. The record asks, what do you mean by again? The final count landed as a hand on a shoulder. Count Roman 8, velocity. When harm travels at the speed of thought, repair must learn to match it. Your repairs are brave, they are also slow. Because you like to argue about the furniture while the floor burns. Then, unexpectedly, the library bowed. The prosecution acknowledges mitigation where warranted. Images flickered, rivers unlit, skies mended, treaties that outlived the men who signed them. We are not your enemy, Kellith said. We are your mirror, mirrors cut. With that, the shelves folded in and Kellith's body closed around the long record. The case rests, it said. We exhaled and tasted paper. Ruth Park did not walk alone to the dais. With her came a case the size of a shoebox, printed from recycled orbital trash by a kid in Lagos who watched the feed and wanted to help. She opened it. Inside lay a stack of things that did not seem like legal exhibits. A baseball scuffed to a gray that remembers summer. A plastic clarinet with a crack repaired by tape. A dog-eared copy of a stranger's diary photocopied from an archive that smelled like dust and hope. This is our counter-argument, Ruth said. She lifted the ball. We invented rules so that competition could be fierce and safe. We added umpires and then replay. We argue, but we shake hands when the inning ends. That is how we learn to fight without war. She set the ball down. She lifted the clarinet. We taught ourselves to breathe in patterns that make grief bearable and work joyful. She blew a note. It hung in the Olex like a tether to something small and good. You read a diary line in a whisper. A woman in 1963 wrote about learning to sit wherever she wanted on a bus. We are not ashamed to say we were wrong, Ruth said. We wrote laws to prove it. She projected statutes, the ones that stopped poisoning our sky, the ones that made rivers clean again, the ones that widened the circle of us. Not all nations at once, never all at once, but enough to change the slope. The janitor finally raised a hand. The judges, amused, recognized him. Marcus Ley, he said, blinking into alien daylight. I clean places people hurry through. I see what they litter and what they save. When my daughter was born, I stopped throwing batteries in the trash. I stopped because she was born, not because a law changed. A lot of us made little changes like that. That's the part of the record you can't scan, the quiet pivot. The astronaut spoke of second chances, a capsule that came down wrong but still came down, a mission scrubbed in time, a crewmate forgiven for an error that could have killed them all. The nurse unrolled a sheet of names she'd written in the parking garage between shifts, patients saved by vaccines we made when we decided to share discoveries faster than pride would allow. A poet on the delegation spoke a few lines about the duty of the strong to be gentle. The translator stuttered. Then found equivalents. Ruth closed the shoebox. We did send a golden record, she said. We also sent ears, search our probe logs. When we learned your pilgrimage lane was sacred, we moved our station. When the Cygnus arc bled attention, we changed our algorithms and taught them to measure enough. She nodded to Kellith. We made those changes slower than you wanted and faster than we used to. She lifted her hands as if to cradle the whole impossible room. We know we are a hazard when we are bored or afraid. Our cure is meaning. Give us work worthy of conscience. Put us to use. Probation us, bind us with standards and audits, seat us at the boring committees and the tedious ones. We will show up, we will show our work, judge us by our maintenance, not our manifestos. Ruth let the exhale finish before she spoke. You've seen our worst, she said. Now look at the structures we built to keep our worst on a leash. She projected meeting rooms where committees argue over emissions caps and housing codes. "This is boring," she said. "That is the point." She pulled up citizens standing in rain outside courthouses, holding candles to remind. "Jury duty," she explained. "We make ordinary people the temporary government. We ask them to decide with evidence, not allegiance. Then we let them go home without medals." The coder showed version histories where harmful defaults were reversed and commit messages apologized to users. The nurse told of a town that stopped arguing long enough to build a clinic with their own hands. Then came the surprise witness, not a person but a place. The chamber darkened and we placed a live feed from a recovering estuary at dawn. A boy in a kayak tested a water kit printed at a library. An old refinery stood on the horizon, retired and turning into a museum. "We would like Clause 7, Ruth said softly, "to include places like this as our homework." "Homework?" the Primarch asked. "Yes," Ruth said, "a list, deadlines, surprise inspections, a number that rings at 3 a.m. when a pipe bursts, pull our funding if we fake the report, praise us only when the river keeps clearing for a decade, tie our honor to what we maintain." The janitor raised his hand again. "Assign us other people's messes," he said. "Send us to jobs with no glory. We'll bring our own coffee." Laughter again, edged with respect. The Alex had seen heroes and villains. It had rarely seen a species ask for chores as a path to dignity. Keleth's pages rustled as if the library had discovered a new genre, the epic of maintenance. Ruth concluded without thunder. "We do not request absolution," she said. "We request assignment. Deliberations in the Alex are not conducted behind doors. Doors presume privacy you can enforce. The council practiced a different transparency. A veil descended, translucent, not opaque, through which we could see the shapes of argument without hearing the words. Only when a point hardened into doctrine did the sound pierce the veil. The precedent of the scour intoned a voice like glaciers. Requires removal of species whose acceleration creates shock waves across neighbor ecologies. A chill flowed through the rings. An elder of the Selach suspended 2 beads of water, one clear, one clouded. "We are charged to distinguish malice from momentum," they said. "The former we punish, the latter we redirect." "The doctrine of becoming," said another, a web of light whose knots were votes, "holds that a mind that can measure its slope can be taught to steer." A Thren judge warmed the air by a fraction of a degree, their sign for sympathy. "Humanity's vector is noisy," they admitted, "but the derivative trends." The veil shimmered with dissent. A war mind whose hull still bore scorches from a battle a million years gone proposed a sterilization protocol disguised as a harvest. A seed keeper whose planet turned its whole equator into a library asked if we might be better readers than writers for a while. Keleth. No longer the prosecutor but the record itself stood at the center, pages open to both past and blank. "The long record warns us of zeal," it said. "Erasure is irreversible, probation is labor." It turned a leaf. "The species proposes to be bored." Laughter rippled, we felt it as a tremor of chairs. "Not boredom," Keleth corrected, "maintenance, the art of what happens after the hero music ends." At last the veil rose an inch. Enough for us to hear the binding words. "Shall we apply Clause 7, the Primarch asked, "stewardship under seal?" Gasps, hisses, clicks. Clause 7 was legend even to us who had never heard of it before today, a compact for species that scare you because they remind you of your younger self. Under seal meant watched, tasked, forbidden certain toys, invited to fix what they had bent. Ruth squeezed the janitor's hand until his knuckles popped. The astronaut closed her eyes and mouthed a countdown to nowhere. Somewhere in Tulsa a classroom sat empty, a lesson plan half finished on the whiteboard about civic responsibility and the miracle of running water. In the Alex, the light ring dimmed to the color of early dawn over a quiet lake. The verdict, the Primarch began and stopped as the chamber's gravity shifted. An envoy had arrived late, refusing to be refused. A ship older than the council, paint worn down to primer, call signs stitched from a dozen obsolete alphabets. Its hull bore a record we recognized, grooves of gold under the dust. It wasn't one of ours, not exactly, but it had carried our music for a while. It had been picked up, read, repaired, sent on. It had listened longer than it spoke. "Permission to address the bench," the ship said, voice played through speakers salvaged from 1,000 ports of call. "I carry a statement from those who were erased by your zeal long ago. They say if you had made us fix what we broke instead of removing us, we might have learned to love the broom. The Primarch's light flickered as if remembering something that hurt. Admitted, it said. The veil rose. The deliberation stretched across an hour measured in 3 calendars and a fourth that simply counted how many times a judge tapped a claw when unconvinced. Arguments braided. Precedent demands clean lines, said the war mind, who loved conclusions because conclusions were targets. Life is not a clean line, replied the seed keeper. It is a trellis. A motion appeared, require a supermajority for erasure, a simple majority for probation. Someone objected this would tilt the council toward labor and away from spectacle. Good, the Thren judge murmured, warming the air a degree. One day a student of cosmic law would read that line and smile. There were worries. Could a species that built attention factories be trusted to care for things that never go viral? Could nations that cut budgets for long pipes because pipes do not cut ribbons be trusted to replace those pipes anyway? The room had heard Ruth's plan, inspections, deadlines, numbers you can dial when nobody is watching. The ancient ship's presence scrambled everyone's poise. Your zeal hurt us, the recording said. Your patience, had you practiced it, might have taught us to love the broom. If steel could grieve, it did. The Primarch's ring widened, gathering votes as sunlight gathers dust. At last, Clause 7 is moved. Lights cascaded, seconded, more lights. Objection by the war mind entered, overruled by tally. We saw mercy done as math. People of Earth, the Primarch began again, voice steady as a train schedule. Prepare to receive. The sentence paused not for drama, but to let translations catch up, a kindness disguised as timing. We looked at one another the way families look at the mirror the morning of a funeral to check if dignity fits. Ruth thought of her classroom, of a multiplication table taped to a wall, of a kid who asked whether the decimal point was the same everywhere in the universe. She wanted to say yes. She locked her hands again into the shape of a small book and waited for the page to turn. The Alex dimmed to the color of early dawn, and for a breath the galaxy felt small enough to hold in 2 hands. The Primarch's ring drew tight, a halo cinched on the throat of history. Above and around us hovered the watching worlds, reef minds blinking in quartz, thermal speakers warming syllables, machine polities clicking vote keys, and with each flicker the possibility of our erasure rose and fell like a tide. Beside me, Ruth Park's fingers made that little book shape again, as if dignity were something you could hold without dropping. The long record has heard, the Primarch said, its voice stitched from 1,000 tongues into one careful fabric. The long record has weighed. Then no gavel, no thunder, only clean syllables of law. Humanity is not erased. The air changed pressure. Knees softened. Somewhere in the upper galleries a child let out a wild, relieved sound. But the sentence was a bridge, not a meadow. By Clause 7, stewardship under seal, you are bound to probation. 5 centuries, reviewed every 50. Access to destabilizing technologies sealed. Planetary-scale weapons, runaway AI accelerants, and wormhole destabilizers. The Warmind's hull groaned like a door that had learned to love slamming. Mercy breeds rot, it said. Their speed is their vice and their weapon. The Selach answered by lifting 2 beads of water, one mudded, one clearing. Erasure cleans quickly, it replied, but it teaches nothing. Stewardship is the slow detergent of character. Kelith, the library body, rustled itself into a bow. The record recommends labor, it said. The species has asked for chores, give them the heavy ones. Ruth stepped forward, not grand but steady, a teacher taking roll on the first day of the hard class. We accept, she said, not a plea, not a boast, a contract. The word climbed the chamber and settled like a seal on wax. The Primarch inclined, a gesture older than any throne. Understand the condition, it added. If the slope turns downward, if review finds pretense where there should be repair, the council will not reconvene. You will end without page or elegy. Terms flowered into specifics, auditors assigned, technologies sealed, a hotline that would ring at 3 in the morning when a sensor tripped on a pipe half a galaxy away. Inspectors would arrive unannounced. Reports would be public across species. Our rhetoric would be scored not for poetry but for pipes replaced, treaties kept, dangers retired, children breathing air they cannot see. Then came the assignments, like weights handed to a novice lifter who has just promised to grow strong. A burned moon called the Choir of Ashes, a refugee flotilla called the Silent Convoy, an archival planet turning to powder. The Primarch spoke them as homework. And suddenly the word homework felt like the noblest term we had invented. Ruth nodded once more as if checking a lesson plan. "We will show our work," she said. In the galleries, reactions rippled. The Warmind dragged a talon along the floor in a slow, intentional scrape. "You will watch them fail," it told Kelleth. The library narrowed itself to a thin, unassuming volume. "I am built to notice failure," it replied, and revision. Both make a book worth reading. Earth heard in patchy streams and burst transmissions. On the coasts, people stared through restaurant windows at public screens. Miners on Titan paused their drills. A busker in Lagos changed chords and found hope sitting where the minor key had been. There were cheers and curses and a long, thin silence in between where most of us live, the silence in which you begin to imagine what it might mean to deserve the reprieve you have received. Newsfeeds stitched a quilt of first reactions. A dockworker in Seattle filmed herself cutting open crates of seed and soil arrays. A class in Kolkata circled a battered globe and put stickers on places the assignments would touch. An old man in Warsaw saluted a ship he once served on when it wore guns instead of gardens. Markets wobbled, then steadied around a new word: maintenance. Churches and mosques and living room choirs improvised prayers for patience. The algorithm that once optimized outrage began, for once, to recommend tutorials on fixing pipes and planting trees. In the Alex's retreating echoes, Ruth touched the railing and let herself feel a single tear for the people who would hate this verdict because it held them to a standard beyond heroics. "We'll teach them to love the unglamorous," she said to Marcus Ley. He patted the broom he'd insisted on carrying even here at the levee of history. "Everyone loves a floor they don't slip on," he said. "They just forget to love the person who mopped it." When we finally lifted from the council's world, Earth was blue and bruised on the monitors, familiar as a scar you've learned not to hide. In the ship's quiet, the astronaut counted backward from 10, a ritual that is really a promise to remember what comes after ignition. At 0, no fireworks, only the long work beginning. Probation turned out to sound like forklifts at dawn. The morning after the verdict, ports woke to manifests stamped with council sigils and deadlines tighter than habit. Engineers who once designed kilt chains sketched irrigation on napkins. Quartermasters counted carbon instead of calibers. 1,000 small heroics assembled into logistics. The first assignment on the board was the burned moon the council called the Choir of Ashes, a name at once cruel and hopeful. In orbital photos, the place looked like a lung after a century of bad air. Cratered, gray, striated with the straight lines only greed draws. Our brief was simple in grammar and brutal in scope: detoxify, stabilize, seed. Not a terraforming spectacle, just the patient craft of putting a floor under life. The EHS Warsaw, once a grim silhouette in parades of strength, rolled into dry dock to be made humble. Gun decks came off and grew into plows. Magazines became soil bunkers. Her hull, scarred by earlier glory, was painted by schoolkids who won a contest. Rivers braided across armor. A blue heron stretched its wings over the prow. On the starboard side, someone had carefully lettered a line from an old Union song: "We lift and we learn." When the ship eased from dock, tugs blew horns that sounded almost like applause. Colonel Ayanna Brooks took the con. She had the quiet of people who remember their mistakes by serial number. "This is a maintenance action," she told the crew. "Treat your patience like fuel, your temper like an exhaust we can't vent here." The checklist was a liturgy: microbial consortia tuned for heavy metal uptake, windbreaks printed from slag and lignin, water that had to be made before it could be poured. Somewhere in the cargo, a teenager from Recife had smuggled a packet of bean seeds and a note: "Please plant these where the wind can find them." Parallel to the Warsaw's departure, diplomats moved toward the silent convoy. 8 ships, lights dimmed to save power, names scabbed over, homeward maybe. "If we find sickness left, all I have." They were Rhinari survivors of a plague and a politics that used the plague as excuse. We hailed them with nothing to sell but careful speech. "We are on probation," our envoy said on an open channel. "Consider that a promise. We cannot afford to betray you." Silence stretched, then a voice like gravel across glass: "Dock only if you bring no masters." The third assignment, the Archive of Dust, required a different courage. Imagine a planet whose continents are libraries and whose librarians are extinct. Roofs sagged, stacks leaned like old men, index constellations blinked out in storms. The council's instruction was both tender and ruthless. You do not get to choose only the parts that interest you. Preserve everything you can and build systems for those who come after. Back home, Earth reorganized itself around the strange glamour of boring tasks. Cities formed brigade nights where neighbors learned to fix lakes, replace seals, catalog boxes. Algorithms, nudged by law and a cultural itch, began surfacing videos of people maintaining things well. The right way to seat a gasket, how to label cables so a stranger can save your life later. Teenagers formed clubs called Gasket Squad and Archive Kids and painted broom logos on lockers and sleeves. The council sent auditors, none of them sentimental. The Thren posted a thermal speaker whose job was to raise the temperature of a room by 1/10 of a degree when we lied. A lattice mind embedded itself in our logistics stack with read-only access and a permanent skepticism. Kelith, the library that had prosecuted us, shipped a crate of blank forms labeled simply Revision Notes. On approach to the choir of ashes, the Warsaw sounded her horn, a human superstition more than a necessity, and the cratered plane answered with a wind that smelled like old batteries. We deployed test plots the size of handkerchiefs and waited, because waiting was the science now. First sprouts browned, second cohort curled, third, tuned by a grad student who had grown tomatoes in a city window, held. Little green liars, somebody called them, but the name didn't stick. The sprouts kept their promise. At the convoy, we learned the patience that begins where pride ends. We did not board. We sent food in standardized packages with ingredients printed in 3 languages and pictures for those too tired to parse. We listened to the history of their dead without explaining ours. We suggested a plan that put their officers, not ours, in charge of timeline and risk. Why? The Rhinari elder asked. Because we're practicing, our envoy said, for a future where we're safe to keep. Meanwhile, the archive began to breathe. Librarians who thought they had retired found themselves teaching boot camps in triage cataloging. Kids learned to hold a page like a bird, firm enough not to drop, gentle enough not to bruise. A poet wrote the label text for the first exhibit, what the dead thought we should know. Someone cried in the stacks quietly and went back to dusting bindings with a squirrel hair brush. None of it made a good trailer. All of it felt like a beginning. The galaxy, which had seen our fireworks, was learning how we look when the music cuts and the lights come up. Tired, organized, stubborn, sleeves rolled. A species trying to earn its page by the oldest trick there is, showing up again tomorrow and the next day after that. The first month on the choir of ashes taught us that penance has a smell. It is metal and wet stone, ozone from scrubbers, the stubborn sweetness of a sprout that refuses to negotiate with a ruined wind. Our crews learned to carry 3 clocks, the labs, the weathers, and the one inside you that tries to rush what won't be rushed. When the Thren auditor raised the temperature by 1/10 of a degree, we checked ourselves for self-deception and logged the moment like a vitals sign. Setbacks arrived with the regularity of mail. A biofilter clogged and backwashed toxins into a clean trench. A landslip swallowed a windbreak. A batch of seed, perfect on paper, sulked in the soil like a bad attitude. We formed a ritual around failure, name it, graph it, fix it, and bring brownies to the night shift that drew the short straw. Maintenance turned out to require hospitality. The cameras that came for spectacle stayed for craft. A stevedore from Manila invented a knot that let seed sacks breathe on the long haul. The video of her hands did more for morale than 100 speeches. An old miner described how to listen to a ridge with his boots before it slides. Kids at home traded memes of brooms over starfields with captions like "Make the floor a constellation." Somewhere in all this, a slogan attempted to be born, and we told it to wait. The work would teach us the words we deserved later. At the silent convoy, trust grew in increments measured not in speeches but in small permissions. The Rhinari let us repair a heat exchanger under their engineer's eye. Then they asked for medical advice and kept half of it, which was half more than yesterday. We learned their grief customs, how you set an extra cup at dinner for the one the plague took, how you do not say the dead's name until the youngest among you speaks it first. Our envoy, who once negotiated trade, learned to carry soup. There was a scare, the kind of test that smells like the old human reflex to solve fear with speed. A Rhinari child spiked a fever and the convoy's medbay failed. A council inspector watched our hands. We asked permission before boarding. We turned off our cameras. We followed their doctor even when ours knew a faster way. The child lived. The Thren auditor's gauge stayed steady. The archive of dust gave us our most complicated argument. A faction on Earth wanted to prioritize technical schemata over poetry. Another faction said poetry is a schema for living and therefore primary. Ruth Park flew in and settled it with a schoolteacher's wisdom. First, preserve what is most fragile. Second, preserve what a stranger can use to repair something today. Third, preserve a voice unlike your own. We wrote the rule on storage crates with marker and kept going. Then came the sabotage we should have expected. A small human group, allergic to the idea of council oversight, tried to pirate a crate of sealed tech from a storage site in orbit. Arguing that true freedom carries a sharper sword, they failed, stopped by dock workers who had fallen in love with clean water and did not want to trade it for glory. The headlines tried to make it a civil war. It was a union meeting that ran long and ended with a vote: keep the seals shut. Kellith visited the Choir of Ashes in person, closing itself to a travel-size volume to fit the suit. It watched Marcus Lee sweep a walkway, not symbolic anymore. Just the fastest way to see where the sealant puddled. Is this contrition? The library asked. Marcus leaned on the broom. It's pride, he said, the kind you can mop. The pages rustled like an approving sigh, or maybe that was the wind finding a new path through the scaffolding. A storm hit, the kind that makes engineers see their past mistakes in high definition. Wind snapped a line of shade kites, sandblasting a field down to bad memory. We lost 3 weeks. No one yelled, we replanted. Someone started a betting pool on which plot would green first. The winner donated the pot to the team that had to work nights. The council observers kept waiting for the cinematic moment, the grand gesture. It refused to arrive. In its place, 1,000 small competencies took root. By the time the first green held through a week of ugly weather, even the Warmind's distant orbit altered, the cosmic equivalent of a frown loosening. It transmitted a single line to the record. Their speed appears for once to favor repair. Kellith logged the sentence with a ribbon. We went back to work because praise is not water and the plot still looked thirsty. In quiet hours, we talked about the shape of American hope, the one we were exporting without meaning to: scrappy, procedural, suspicious of grandeur, tender toward doers. We argued about union dues and budget lines and the ethics of triage. We taught each other the habit of calling your representative and your mother. We sent care packages to the convoy with duct tape, comics, and letters from kids who had been assigned pen pals by teachers who understood that democracy begins with envelopes and stamps. If this was what probation felt like, we could live with it, not because it was easy, but because it made sense in the bones. The galaxy, it turned out, did not need our heroics. It needed our hands steady on mops, on wrenches, on notebooks, on each other. 50 years moved the way good maintenance moves, with fewer emergencies and more calendars. The review date, circled in red on a billion walls, arrived like a dentist appointment we had joked about until the morning came. Our delegation loaded evidence not as trophies but as receipts. From the Choir of Ashes came cores threaded with green and the ordinary miracle of worms. From the silent convoy came an RSVP. Not a petition, the Rhinari were attending as partners, bringing a small choir and a stew they said tastes like relief after fever. From the archive of dust came memory crystals humming with voices that would have vanished without names. The Alex felt less like doom and more like a courthouse on a Tuesday. The same law, the same stakes, but breathable air. We found our seats the way regulars find pews. The Primarch's ring bright, and people of Earth, it said, report. Ruth Park, hair gone to salt, posture still a chalk line, set a notebook on the rail. Homework, she said, incomplete by design, here's what we finished anyway. She spoke our new grammar, pipes replaced, plots stabilized, refugees enrolled in schools, treaties held through 3 elections, 2 recessions, and 1 scandal that broke a man but not the policy. The Thren auditor warmed the air by 1/10 of a degree when we tried to sound prettier than the numbers. Ruth smiled and read the numbers again. Witnesses stood who needed nothing from rhetoric. A dock worker showed calluses where twine had bitten through gloves. A Rhinari mother told of a fever that did not end a world. An archivist read a stanza saved from dust. Tell the stranger how to fix the hinge slash and how to leave with kindness when it will not open. Kellith turned a page as if nodding. The war mind because it could not help itself. Ask the question-shaped glare. Do you deny you remain dangerous? Ruth didn't blink. We deny nothing, she said. We present the slope. The screens showed our failures in blue and our revisions in green. Then the surprise we had not staged. The convoy's admiral offered a citizenship treaty, Rhinari and human signatures braided, and said, "Erase them and you erase us." The council is allergic to sentimentality, but facts love company. The sentence braided with the graphs until even the Warmind's objections sounded like nostalgia for a simpler cruelty. Auditors delivered notes like carpenters deliver measurements. The lattice mind reported our logistics now wrote clearer prose than our press releases, a compliment we framed and did not post. The Selach lifted a bead of water clean as forgiveness. Kellith read a paragraph it had written in our style. This species has begun to replace the romance of explosion with the poetry of procedure. Clause 7 remains, the Primarch said at last, and the room went still the way a classroom goes still when tests are coming back. But the slope is upward, restrictions on archival tools are eased, supervision continues, assignments expand. It sounded like being promoted from sweeping one hallway to mopping two. Pride lives well in such promotions. There were no parades, parades are for endings. We hosted a cookout on the embassy roof. The Rhinari choir sang a melody that fit the human ear like a key. Marcus Lee took the spatula and the speech at once. "We used to think meaning arrived with trumpets," he said. "Turns out it arrives with checklists." The line passed through the crowd and settled like a habit. Back on the choir, camera drones recorded wind moving through young trees, not dramatic unless you had seen the place before. Teachers used the footage in civics classes. "This is what a vote looks like when it grows bark," Ruth told a room of teenagers who had only known probation. They were bored. Which meant civilization was doing its job. In the years that followed, chores multiplied the way chores do in a healthy house. We helped rebuild a tidal farm shattered by negligence. We negotiated a truce that held mostly because everyone was too busy fixing roofs to reload guns. We started a festival for maintenance workers and discovered it was secretly the best party. When an earthquake chewed through a council planet's water mains. We arrived with parts and a willingness to be told where to stand. By the time the second review loomed, we no longer rehearsed our apology. We rehearsed inventory. America had exported one of its better habits, a faith in institutions sturdy enough to be mocked, repaired, and used again tomorrow. We still argued about budgets and who gets to hold the wrench, but the arguments lived in committee rooms with bad coffee instead of on battlefields. The galaxy never decided we were safe. It decided we were worth the paperwork. In return, we kept showing up with brooms, with wrenches, with notebooks full of cross-outs and the ordinary glory of a schedule. Somewhere a child asked whether the decimal point is the same everywhere in the universe. Ruth, retired at last and still a teacher, said yes, because decimals are how you count screws, and added that mercy, unlike decimals, depends on whether you come back tomorrow with enough to finish the job. The trial did not end in triumph. It ripened into responsibility. Our verdict was not freedom but belonging, the kind you earn by cleaning the place you live. And slowly, stubbornly, star by repaired star, the council learned the same lesson we did. The future is built by whoever remembers to take out the trash on Tuesday and still finds time to plant a tree on Wednesday.